My sister accused me of stealing her engagement ring, and my parents kicked me out. 3 years later, Dad called saying, "The ring was in the garbage disposal all along." I hung up and felt something I hadn't experienced in years: cold, calculating satisfaction. They'd finally discovered the truth, but it was far too late for them to undo what they'd done to me. The irony wasn't lost on me. For 3 years, I'd rebuilt my entire life from nothing while they lived with their guilt and shame. Now they wanted forgiveness, reconciliation, a chance to make things right. But they had no idea who they were dealing with anymore. The scared, confused kid they had thrown out at 23 was gone. In his place stood someone who understood leverage, timing, and exactly how to make people pay for their choices. I stared at my phone, watching it buzz with incoming calls from my mother, then Gemma, then Dad again. Each rejected call felt like a small victory. For the first time since this nightmare began, I held all the cards. They needed something from me. My forgiveness, my presence at family gatherings, my willingness to pretend their betrayal never happened. But I needed nothing from them except the satisfaction of watching them squirm. The mental shift was remarkable. 3 years ago, I would have answered immediately, eager to hear their apologies and desperate to come home. Now I recognize their panic for what it was: complete loss of control over a situation they'd created. They'd gambled everything on being right about me stealing that ring, and they'd lost catastrophically. The question wasn't whether they deserved forgiveness. It was how thoroughly I wanted to destroy them before considering it. I set my phone to silent and opened my laptop. If my family wanted to play games about timing and consequences, they were about to learn from an expert. Over the past 3 years, I'd transformed from a directionless grocery store clerk into a logistics coordinator for a regional transportation company. My specialty was analyzing complex systems, identifying pressure points, and implementing solutions that maximized efficiency while minimized costs. Those same skills would serve me perfectly in handling this family crisis. My professional background gave me advantages they couldn't imagine. I'd spent 3 years learning how supply chains worked, how leverage operated in business relationships, and how timing could make the difference between profit and catastrophic loss. I understood documentation, legal liability, and the importance of controlling information flow. Most importantly, I'd learned to think strategically rather than emotionally, a skill that would prove invaluable in the coming weeks. My financial position was stronger than they knew. While they'd assumed I was barely surviving, I'd actually thrived in my independence. My current salary was $48,000 annually, with full benefits and a solid 401k contribution. I owned my car outright, had $12,000 in savings, and maintained excellent credit. More importantly, I had no debt and no financial dependencies. Unlike them, I could weather any storm financially while making purely strategic decisions. The contrast with my family's situation was stark. Mom and Dad were approaching retirement with limited savings and a mortgage they had refinanced twice to help fund Gemma's lifestyle. Gemma herself had never held a job for more than 18 months and was completely dependent on Tom's lawyer's salary and my parents' financial support. Dad's high school teacher pension would barely cover their basic expenses, and Mom's nursing income was their only reliable cash flow. They needed family stability and emotional peace far more than I did. But my greatest advantage was information. Over the past 3 years, I'd maintained contact with exactly one person from home, my cousin Jake, who'd moved back after college and worked at the local bank. Through Jake, I knew everything about my family's financial struggles, relationship problems, and social standing in our small Ohio town. They had no idea I possessed this intelligence, which gave me enormous strategic leverage. Jake had kept me informed about Gemma's engagement troubles, how she'd become increasingly difficult and demanding, how Tom had twice postponed their wedding, and how she'd been fired from her marketing job for attendance issues. He'd told me about my father's diabetes complications requiring expensive medications, and about Mom picking up extra shifts to cover mounting medical bills. Most importantly, he'd shared that the whole family had become social pariahs in town after word spread about how they'd treated me. My network of professional contacts provided additional strategic resources. Through my logistics work, I'd developed relationships with attorneys who specialized in employment and family law. I had accountant connections who understood financial planning and tax implications. My supervisor had even mentioned that our company's legal department handled personal consultations for employees. These weren't just random professionals. They were people who knew my character and would provide honest advice about my options. The documentation I'd accumulated over 3 years was comprehensive and damaging. Every rejected phone call was logged in my phone records. Every attempt at reconciliation they had made was saved in emails and voicemails. I had a detailed timeline of their abandonment, complete with dates, quotes, and witness testimony from Jake about how they'd described the situation to others. If this became a legal or social battle, my evidence was overwhelming. Perhaps most importantly, I'd built credibility in our hometown through Jake's updates to mutual acquaintances. People knew I'd been working steadily, supporting myself, and maintaining dignity despite being wrongly accused. The narrative had slowly shifted from Elliot stole the ring to Elliot got a raw deal. My reputation was not only restored, but enhanced by how I'd handled the adversity. 3 years of professional experience had taught me that successful negotiations required clear objectives, strong leverage, and perfect timing. I needed to define exactly what I wanted from this situation before taking any action. Revenge was tempting, but ultimately limited. What I really wanted was acknowledgement of what they'd done, acceptance of responsibility for the consequences, and assurance that nothing like this would ever happen again. I spent the evening researching my legal position with online resources and planning my next moves. The statute of limitations for filing a defamation suit was still active, though I had no intention of actually pursuing litigation. However, the mere possibility would concentrate their minds wonderfully. I also researched the psychological principles of family reconciliation, looking for insights about how to manage the process from a position of strength. My first strategic decision was about timing. Every day I waited to respond increased their anxiety and desperation while strengthening my negotiating position. They needed to understand viscerally that they had no power to force reconciliation on their timeline. I would engage with them only when it served my strategic interests, not because they demanded immediate forgiveness. The calls continued throughout the week, escalating in frequency and emotional intensity. Mom left tearful voicemails about how sorry they were and how much they missed me. Dad's messages were shorter, but carried an undertone of desperation I'd never heard before. Gemma's voicemails were the most revealing. She alternated between self-flagellating apologies and barely concealed anger that I wasn't immediately absolving her of guilt. By Friday, Jake texted me with intelligence that confirmed my strategy was working. "Dude, your family is losing their minds. Your mom called my mom crying about how you won't answer the phone. Your dad asked me directly if I knew how to reach you. Gemma showed up at my apartment, looking like she hadn't slept in days. They're really panicking." The panic was exactly what I needed. Desperate people made poor decisions and accepted unfavorable terms. The longer they waited for my response, the more likely they were to agree to whatever conditions I eventually imposed. I was reversing the power dynamic that had defined our relationship for decades. Instead of me needing them, they needed me. On Sunday evening, I finally returned Dad's call. His relief was palpable when he heard my voice, which immediately told me how thoroughly I controlled this situation. "Elliot, thank God. We need to talk. We need to fix this." "Do we?" I kept my voice neutral and professional. "Because from where I'm sitting, this situation was fixed 3 years ago when you threw me out. I adapted to your decision and built a life without you. The ring being found doesn't actually change anything about what you did to me." The silence stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. When Dad finally spoke, his voice was smaller than I'd ever heard it. "Son, we made a terrible mistake. We know that now. We want to make it right." "What does making it right look like to you?" I asked. "Because I'm genuinely curious what you think could possibly compensate for 3 years of believing I'm a thief, 3 years of telling our entire community that I stole from family, and 3 years of refusing to speak to me even when I tried to reach out." Another long silence. Dad was clearly unprepared for me to approach this conversation strategically rather than emotionally. He'd expected tears, accusations, maybe some yelling. Instead, he was getting cross-examined by someone who understood exactly how much damage had been done and wasn't interested in minimizing it for his comfort. "We want you to come home," he finally said. "We want to be a family again." "That's what you want," I replied. "But what are you offering?" Because I already have a home, a job, friends, and a life I built myself. I don't actually need anything from you anymore. So, if you want me to consider disrupting my established life to accommodate your guilt, you're going to have to make a compelling case. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Dad making increasingly desperate offers. They'd pay for me to go back to school, they'd help me buy a house, they'd do whatever it takes to repair our relationship. But he couldn't articulate any understanding of exactly what they'd done wrong or provide any assurance it wouldn't happen again. Most telling, he kept talking about what they wanted rather than acknowledging what I'd lost. By the end of the call, I'd established several key points. I was under no obligation to forgive them, their guilt was not my responsibility to relieve, and any reconciliation would happen entirely on my terms and timeline. Dad agreed to a face-to-face meeting the following weekend, but only after accepting that it would be held at a location of my choosing, and that I might very well decide our relationship was irreparable. The week between that call and our scheduled meeting was crucial preparation time. I consulted with Rebecca Hayes, an attorney who'd handled several cases for my logistics company. She confirmed that my family's public accusations could constitute defamation, especially since they'd damaged my reputation in a small community where everyone knew everyone. More importantly, she helped me understand the legal framework around family reconciliation and what protections I could insist upon. I also spoke with my company's employee assistance counselor, who specialized in family trauma and workplace stress. She helped me identify specific outcomes I wanted from reconciliation and warning signs that would indicate my family wasn't genuinely committed to change. Most valuably, she helped me recognize that forgiveness was something I could grant or withhold based entirely on my own emotional needs, not their desire for absolution. My logistics supervisor, David Foster, provided an unexpected perspective when I explained my situation. He'd dealt with similar family estrangement issues and emphasized the importance of clear boundaries and enforceable agreements. In business, we don't do deals with people who've proven unreliable unless they provide guarantees and accept oversight, he told me. Family relationships aren't that different. Trust has to be rebuilt systematically, not just declared restored. The meeting location I chose was strategically important. A conference room at a business hotel in a city halfway between my current home and theirs. Neutral territory ensured nobody had psychological advantage from familiar surroundings. The formal setting would keep the conversation professional rather than dissolving into emotional manipulation. Most importantly, I could leave whenever I chose without being trapped in their space or having to kick them out of mine. When they arrived, all three of them, despite my specifying that only my parents should come, I could see immediately that the past 3 years had aged them significantly. Mom looked exhausted and had gained weight. Dad's hair had gone completely gray, and his shoulders carried a permanent slump. Gemma appeared almost fragile, lacking the confident energy that had defined her personality since childhood. Their body language told the story of people carrying enormous guilt and shame. They sat stiffly, avoided eye contact, and waited for me to speak first. A complete reversal of the family dynamic I remembered. For the first time in my adult life, they were uncertain, and I was completely in control. Before we discuss anything else, I began, I need you to understand where we stand. 3 years ago, you accused me of theft without evidence, searched my possessions without permission, ignored my denials, and expelled me from this family based on assumptions. The ring being lost down the garbage disposal doesn't erase those choices. It just proves you were wrong about the facts, not about your character or judgment. Gemma started to interrupt, but I held up my hand. I'm not finished. For 3 years, I've lived with the consequences of your decisions. I've been estranged from family, excluded from holidays and celebrations, and forced to build an entirely new life from scratch. Those consequences don't disappear just because you've finally discovered the truth. So, if you want any kind of relationship with me going forward, we need to establish some ground rules. The conversation that followed was the most honest discussion our family had ever had. I laid out exactly what I expected, a public acknowledgement of their mistake to everyone they'd told about the theft, a formal written apology detailing what they'd done wrong and committing to behavioral changes, and a clear understanding that rebuilding trust would be a gradual process entirely under my control. More importantly, I established consequences for future violations of my boundaries. Any attempt to manipulate me emotionally would result in immediate cessation of contact. Any sharing of family business with extended relatives or community members would end our relationship permanently. Any expectation that I should prioritize their emotional needs over my own well-being would be grounds for cutting them off completely. The meeting lasted 4 hours and was emotionally exhausting, but strategically successful. They agreed to every condition I imposed, primarily because they had no leverage to negotiate. The power dynamic had been completely reversed. They needed reconciliation far more than I did, which meant they had to accept my terms. Over the following months, the consequences of their original decision continued rippling through their lives in ways they hadn't anticipated. The public apology they issued to clear my name had only drawn more attention to their poor judgment and created lasting social awkwardness in our small town. Friends and neighbors who'd initially supported them began questioning what kind of parents wouldn't believe their own son without proof. Gemma's engagement to Tom finally collapsed entirely when he realized how easily she'd been willing to believe the worst about family members. If she could turn on her own brother so quickly, what did that say about her loyalty and character as a potential wife? The wedding was canceled permanently, leaving Gemma devastated and financially dependent on my parents at age 32. Dad's reputation in the schools suffered significantly when word spread about the family situation. Parents began questioning his judgment and fairness, wondering if he brought the same rush to judgment into his classroom. While he wasn't fired, he was quietly encouraged to take early retirement rather than face continued scrutiny from the school board. Mom's situation at the hospital became uncomfortable as colleagues realized what had happened. Healthcare professionals deal with difficult family situations regularly, and her willingness to exile her son based on unfounded accusations raised questions about her character and decision-making abilities. She found herself increasingly isolated at work and eventually transferred to a different department. The financial consequences were equally severe. Without my potential support they'd counted on, despite expelling me, they struggled to manage mounting expenses. Dad's early retirement reduced their income significantly while their medical bills continued increasing. They'd assumed I would eventually return and contribute to family finances, but my absence meant those expectations could never be fulfilled. Meanwhile, my own life continued flourishing in ways that highlighted their losses. I received a promotion to senior logistics coordinator with a salary increase to $55,000 annually. I bought a small house in a neighborhood where my background and character were known and respected. Most importantly, I maintained relationships with extended family members and hometown friends who'd come to understand the truth about what happened. The contrast between our trajectories was stark and intentional. Every success I achieved without them demonstrated their irrelevance to my happiness and prosperity. Every struggle they faced because of their choices proved that actions have lasting consequences that can't be undone with simple apologies. By the 1-year mark of our reconciliation process, the terms of our relationship had stabilized into something entirely on my conditions. I visited for major holidays, but stayed in local hotels rather than their house. I participated in family gatherings, but only for limited time periods. I maintained cordial but distant relationships with each of them, making it clear that trust would be rebuilt gradually based on their behavior, not their promises. The strategic approach had worked perfectly. I'd transformed a situation where they held all the power, and I was desperate for acceptance into one where they needed my forgiveness more than I needed their approval. They learned definitively that accusations have consequences. Family relationships require trust earned through actions rather than assumed through blood, and some mistakes create permanent changes that can't be reversed through regret alone. Gemma never fully recovered from losing both her brother's respect and her fiancé's trust in the same period. She eventually found a retail job and began slowly rebuilding her life, but the confident, ambitious person she'd been was permanently changed by understanding how quickly success could disappear through poor judgment. Dad's early retirement became a source of daily regret, as he realized his teaching career had been his primary source of identity and purpose. Without the classroom, he struggled with depression and isolation, understanding too late that his rush to judgment had cost him both his son's respect and his professional reputation. Mom adapted better than the others, but continued carrying visible guilt about her role in the family's disintegration, knowing that her grief was entirely self-inflicted. I maintained limited contact with them indefinitely, but always from a position of strength rather than need. The scared, confused young man they'd expelled from their family was gone forever, replaced by someone who understood leverage, timing, and the importance of making people face consequences for their choices.